Thank you for being here. I know it's a really busy time in the semester, so we do have some people who are arriving late, and we have many that wanted to be here and unfortunately can't. So we are recording this event, just so you know, and the Q&A portion will also be recorded. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering on unceded Indigenous land. SFU campus is located, this campus is located on the Coast Salish, the land of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I wanted to pay my respects and also acknowledge my responsibilities as a settler to take an active role in reconciliation and land back efforts. So my name is Megan McKenzie. I'm the Simons Chair in International Law and Human Security and the Director of the School for International Studies. And I'll introduce our co-panelists shortly. Just note that if you are inclined and you want to tweet, there's the Twitter handle for SFU, the School for International Studies, and our panelists. And again, that our session's going to be recorded. So the main question of the panel is, are militaries and military institutions inherently dysfunctional? So I've done work on military culture, integration of women into combat roles, military suicide, sexual violence in the military for over a decade now. And this question continually comes up. And answering it, or at least reflecting on this question, I think is important because ultimately, the extent to which militaries and military institutions are capable of reform affects what type of research is useful or possible or even reasonable. So for example, if we want to suggest radical culture change, we wouldn't suggest that if we ultimately don't think militaries are even possible or even capable of reform. So let's get to the two reasons why I organized this panel. The first is that this is a question that I'm really interested in and I constantly focus on, and my research really centers around it, and I still don't have the answer to it. So as I often do when I'm trying to unpack a question, I get together some of the smartest people I know who are also doing this kind of work, and that I know will help us to answer this question. The second reason I organized this panel, I think it's an excellent example of the kind of work that happens at the School for International Studies. We're an interdisciplinary unit. We look at complex problems from various perspectives and help our students to look at complex problems from various perspectives. And I think there's a real value of having different disciplinary perspectives on a common question. I really wanted to take this unique opportunity to highlight the work of Ben Wadham, who's visiting us from Australia, and I've worked with him for years, so it's nice to see him here in Canada, and the work of our incredible postdocs Sally and David, and to bring Colleen Bell, who's in the neighborhood in Saskatchewan, here to join the conversation. So without further ado, I think we should get started. So just to give you a sense of how things are going to run, I'll just give a very brief introduction to everyone. Everyone's going to speak just for around 10 minutes. And because time is limited, really the speakers are just going to give you a snapshot into how their research kind of starts to address this key question. So our first speaker is going to be Colleen Bell, who's an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Her work, as she'll talk to you about, includes attention to dysfunction within Canada's Royal Canadian Mounted Police and sexual abuse by Canadian peacekeepers. Then next is going to be Sally Sheriff, who is the Simons Foundation Canada Postdoctoral Fellow at the School for International Studies and holds a PhD in political science from the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and she's going to talk to you about her work looking at post-conflict stability with a focus on Colombia. Then we're going to hear from David Thompson, second from the end, who's also a postdoctoral fellow here at the school and holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from the University of California. And David's going to focus on his work on prisons and incarceration in Brazil. And then Ben Wadham last but not least, is a professor of sociology and veteran studies at Flinders University in Australia. It's also his first time being in North America, so I'm very happy he's made the trip. And the director of Open Door, understanding and supporting service personnel and their families. He's a veteran and has done work on military culture, military suicide, institutional abuse. He and I just wrote a piece on military culture, and we've been sort of collaborating and having these conversations for several years. So I'll turn it over to you, Colleen.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Didn't expect to be holding. It's quite large. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that one. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Megan. Thanks for inviting me to come. It's been nice as well to meet everybody else on the panel. So I come from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, where we're all treaty people. And today I wanted to share with you some of the findings from some interview research that I did during the pandemic, all on Zoom, with Canadian police officers deployed to peacekeeping missions in several countries, but mainly Haiti. And so about over 600 police officers have deployed to Haiti between 2011 and, well, there were some earlier as well, but up until at least 2019. And these were part of mainly the MINUSTA and MINJUSTA missions in Haiti. And what I was trying to look at was their role in advancing liberal values in the work that they did, and their experience of working with the UN to advance a stabilization agenda and what that looked like. And one of the things I got back very broadly from the interview research was a lot of frustration among officers and a feeling that much of their work that they were doing was not effective, or that it made little to no difference, that the UN system was deeply dysfunctional, and that they felt often objectives were rarely met and sometimes pointless or even counterproductive. But one element of this dysfunction that came up that I hadn't really structured questions around was the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse. And so it was a bit of a light bulb moment, a kind of unexpected finding where researchers want to follow that trail. But in addition to that, I had recently, just before this, seen a CBC story where there were revelations of 6 Canadian police officers that were found to have committed sexual exploitation and abuse in Haiti between 2011 and 2017. One of these officers actually threatened a woman with a UN-issued handgun. And in a statement to the CBC, the RCMP noted that it strictly prohibits intimate or sexual relationships with members of the local population. And despite the UN notifying Canada of the investigation's findings, there's little evidence of disciplinary or criminal action taken by Canada. And so, for example, a couple of the officers had very short suspensions, around 5 to 9 days. A couple of them retired and avoided sanctions altogether. One, there was not enough evidence, and then the other was subject to an appeal, the outcome of which I haven't been able to find out about. And so, I'd say that the takeaway is that the consequences for Canadians engaged in sexual exploitation and abuse are weak, and that the justice for victims is often non-existent. And I think this fits with the fact that the majority of my interviewees encountered sexual exploitation and abuse, either as victims themselves, as witnesses, as part of the rumor mill, and they talked about it because they were concerned about it. It was something that they felt was very problematic and really undermined the work that they were trying to do. And the overarching message I got from them was that sexual exploitation was essentially everywhere and very pervasive. But what I became really interested in is how they described the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse. Because I think that how people describe an issue is often a window into why they think it matters, and how they make sense of it, and how important they think it is, and what they see as the potential remedy. And I would add to that it's also important because paying attention to how an issue is described is a good way to gauge the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of existing policies, or help us gauge whether policies are based on facts or stereotypes about who commits sexual exploitation and abuse or why it happens. And so in trying to kind of answer the question about how it's described, led me to organize my findings in terms of 3 discourses, or sort of claims about how the world works from the officers themselves, and their views on who does it, who's trying to stop it and how, why it keeps happening, and so forth. So I'm not going to say this is everything everyone said, but broadly, the first discourse, which I've termed here, "It's them, not us," was really a discourse around how, many of them noted that Canadians had committed sexual exploitation and abuse and knew something about that, but often quickly argued that they had done so less than other contributing countries. And so here's some of the things that people talked about when I asked them. They said, well, there's a lot of African countries that's sort of like, these are the main countries that produce these problems. The French, in another case, were identified as being particularly horrible. And so it wasn't just what they were saying about the countries, but how they were positioning it in relation to Canada. And often when they did talk about Canada, there was a kind of characterization of the conduct as incidental impairment. So, that it was young officers who didn't have, weren't thinking straight, or had, drank too much, or were immature, those kinds of things, rather than being credited to like the framing of a whole country or region as particularly problematic and sort of like national attributes being kind of identified specifically. And I think also this kind of framings can leave the impression of patterns that may or may not exist, but nonetheless I think circulated. The second discourse, which I've called here "Canada has superior values," was really the idea that, the UN and other countries fail to sanction sexual exploitation and abuse in practice, while Canada does sanction it, which, based on the story that I just told you, isn't entirely true. And that Canada really holds its peacekeepers to a higher standard that is very value-driven. And so they talked about how, the UN discourages it, but it doesn't really forbid it in practice, but that Canada really has a zero-tolerance policy. And also that, again, other countries were sometimes characterized as having no concept of humanitarian aid, no concept of human life, that for certain cultures and certain countries, a human life meant nothing, in contrast to Canada. And this idea as well that one officer told me that he kind of espoused to a younger officer who said, that it's not fair, this guy does it, he stays, and his response was, yeah, well, this guy's not from Canada, you are. And then the third discourse, which is this is my last slide, was what I would call "it's a Haitian thing," which was really emerged from interview research suggesting that it was the local people, the people of the country, the host country, that undermined efforts by the UN and contributing states to eliminate sexual exploitation and abuse because of their culture. And often in these depictions, these sort of cultural difference were often accentuated, I would say. Kind of lost my spot here. It was often accentuated, if not presented as largely like deterministic of behavior. And so one is, they try to sleep with you to make some money. It's horrible, but it was happening everywhere. And another one, which I found particularly surprising, was an argument that it was essentially a rite of passage within the culture itself. That if young girls are subject to gang rape or sexual assault, it means they're desirable and could potentially be married someday. And so I think this kind of idea suggests that exploitation and abuse is permitted by the local culture and is even encouraged because it works towards the achievement of desirable social outcomes, and therefore maybe isn't really exploitation. So in conclusion, I would say that sexual exploitation and abuse is a consequence of dysfunction in the sense that it occurs even though it's a clear violation of the UN zero tolerance policy. and Canadian laws as well, and represents arguably a kind of breakdown in the chain of command in a certain sense. But I think my findings concur with a paper that I was reading by Sally earlier today on conflict-related sexual violence, because I found that norms and laws against sexual exploitation and abuse have a visible impact on peacekeeper behavior, in the sense that my interviewees themselves were very aghast at it. They saw it as a violation of the point of peacekeeping. They told me about it because they were concerned about it. It came up for them. But I would say at the same time, the dysfunction itself was identified by my interviewees as circumscribed. On the one hand, there's an acceptance that this abuse is a consequence of systemic dysfunction, but the dysfunction is confined to the UN system and other countries and Haitians themselves. And it's presented, I think, therefore, as a kind of conditional dysfunction, where culpability itself is othered. And another way I'm kind of thinking about this is in relation to the idea of self-exemption. That in actual fact, the lack of sanctions in practice and in the minds of Canadian peacekeepers is sort of happening, if you like. So that's all I got to say. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Thanks to Megan for organizing this. Thank you for reading my paper. I want to talk about a slightly different issue, which is the reform of militaries and structures that mimic military structures that are rebel groups. There have been 73 such programs to reform either state militaries or rebel groups since 1980. These are called disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs, DDR. As you can see, most of these have happened in the last 2 decades, and most of them have happened in the global south. And these are attempts to reform the rebels or the state militaries and turn them into active citizens or political actors within the democratic institutions of countries. Now, not all of these have been successful. This is data from a data set that I created during my PhD. Of all the DDR programs, about 51% have been unsuccessful. The rebels or the state militaries have rearmed, have regrouped, and have restarted civil war in the countries where they were demobilized. Now, these are very expensive programs. I want to give you a few numbers. For instance, in 1991, there was a DDR program in Ethiopia after an alliance of rebel groups won over the state from the Derg regime, from a communist Derg regime, and they tried to demobilize the state military of the Ancien regime. And that program, it took 7 years, and it cost 200 million US dollars. Most of it came from international organizations, including the World Bank and the US Department of Defense. And then there was another program, DDR program, in the year 2000, after the Ethiopia-Eritrea war. That one cost 174 million US dollars, and only 3 million US dollars came from the Ethiopian government. The rest came from the World Bank. So these are programs that are mostly financed by the global North countries, because that's where the budget of the UN and the World Bank come from. Now, these, like I said, they don't always succeed. One of the good examples is the recent DDR program with the militaries, the state military of Iraq, some of whose commanders rearmed to form what we now know to be the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq. Now, another example that I want to focus on today is an ongoing DDR program. It's contemporary as we speak. This is ongoing. The DDR program with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. which also changed its name to the People's Army at some point. And I focused on the FARC because it had a military structure very close to a state military. This is as close as a rebel group could get to a state military structure. There was a national secretariat, a group of between 8 to 12 men who decided for the group. And then there were 7 blocks. This is the equivalent of a brigade or a battalion in a state military. And each of these were headed by top-level commanders. And then each block was consisted of several fronts. And these fronts had mid-level commanders leading them. Now, the names of the fronts sort of correspond to geographic regions. Now, I want to know why of the 13,000 FARC combatants that disarmed and demobilized in 2017, when the famous peace agreement with the FARC was signed, around 3,000 of them rearmed. So the DDR program with the FARC has not failed, but it also hasn't been a full success. And I asked why some of these mid-level commanders, so commanders of the fronts, why some of them have rearmed while others have successfully remained within the peace process. Let's take the example of Alvarado Castillo Colorado, alias Solis Almeida. He was the commander of Front 19 of the Caribbean bloc. And when the peace agreement was signed in November of 2016, he led his men into a demobilization camp that's called ETCR Tierra Grata in the province of Cesar. He led the demobilization process. When I interviewed him in 2019, he said, there's no chance I want to go back to war. Our networks with the rest of the country are broken. There's no way we can recreate the FARC network, and therefore he has stayed within legality. He's played a very important role in the demobilization and reintegration of his men. On the other hand, Jose Vicente Lesmes, alias Walter Mendoza, he was the commander of the mobile column Arturo Ruiz of the Western Bloc, and he led ex-combatants in the demobilization camp of La Elvira in the province of Cauca. He was the soccer coach for the camp. He led education programs. He did everything right, but nevertheless, in 2019, he appeared in this video. He's the one closest to me. Walter Mendoza appears in a video of FARC recidivists. The video includes top and mid-level commanders who say we have rearmed. The video was apparently shot somewhere in Venezuela, we're not sure, and they say we are going to continue this fight. Now, to be able to explain this phenomenon, me and my co-author Darren Igrel, we created a data set of all the top and mid-level commanders of the FARC, including their age, education level, their position during the war, who they were fighting with, who their network, who was included in the network that they had, the regional networks, and then what their position was after the war. Were they given a political position in the political party that the FARC created, or did they have field position, what they did? And based on this, we create a network, a social network of the FARC. This is the FARC in 1993. So the squares are the blocks, and the circles are the provinces. So the one on top is the Caribbean bloc. It was active in the Caribbean part of Colombia. And as you can see, it's a very dense network. There are a lot of places or a lot of provinces where each of these blocks are collaborating. Now, the network becomes less dense in 2012. A lot of those ties are cut because of what we collectively know as Plan Colombia, the plan by President Clinton to help the Colombian military to attack the FARC. Now, what I do is, I won't get into it, but I run something called a spatial lag model on the network of the FARC in 2012 to understand whether these network ties, whether these connections during the war are sort of simulated in the decision to rearm by these mid-level commanders. And my findings, which I will show you in a second, sort of goes against the common understanding that we have of defection defection or rearmament. A lot of what we understand comes from terrorism studies or from suicides by veterans or defection from state militaries, which always say if like the most secluded parts of the network are supposed to rearm. So if you look at this network, it's the Caribbean bloc that's supposed to rearm because they're the most secluded, they're out there, the lone wolves of our society. In journalistic reports that have been coming out from the horrific mass shooting at Michigan State University last week, a lot of reports have been mentioning that the gunman was an eremit. He never left his bedroom. He was a social outcast. He couldn't hold down jobs, according to his father. And as a society, in our research, in academic research, we tend to sort of emphasize on these outcasts that tend to rearm. What I find, however, is that that is not true. It is more the central parts of the network that are more likely to rearm. And as you can see in this graph, the higher the distance from the center, so the more you move to the periphery, the more you get to those outcasts, those lone wolves, the lower the probability that they would rearm. And I say, well, the reason this happens is because rebel groups are inherently different from state militaries. And one of the most important differences is that they rely on civilian support. Any kind of rebel group, be they a guerrilla structure, or be they a group that engages in conventional warfare, they rely on civilians. And my research from the field, talking to civilians, shows that unless these people, because this is a case of rearmament, unless these recidivists show up with a lot of force, with a large number of people, they're not really taken seriously by the civilians, because civilians tend to say, well, you guys, you disarmed, you moved to the demobilization camps, why did you come back now? So unless they can show a show of force, and unless these commanders can regain their status that they had during the war by showing up among a group that they fought together with, otherwise nobody knows them. So as long as they can recreate those networks of the war, and as long as they can rejoin people that they fought with during the war, they are not going to rearm. So it's actually not the lone wolves in the case of rebel groups, not the people on the periphery that rearm, but the core. And I think this has major implications for the way that we do disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, because like I said, these are programs that have grave consequences for societies where they take place if the rebels or the state militaries rearm, and they're also very costly, both for the countries where they take place and for us living in the global north. Thank you.
Introduce them.
I think it's Ben first and then you, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Sorry, I introduced the wrong way, but we'll adapt. We'll adapt.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Megan, for organising this event. And it's been great to come to Canada and spend some time in Vancouver. And then tomorrow we're off to Halifax for another military culture event. I served in the Australian Defence Force in the 1990s, and from that experience in the infantry and in the military police, I became interested in the way in which the military culture operates. So I came up with questions really about how groups of men behave and operate, with that sense of exceptionalism and that sense of licence, that you know, they're doing a job which no one else can do, and that they're exceptional in that regard. So I've been researching this now for about 20 years, I think, 2003. And I started off by researching the reform of the military justice system. And through that process I became very aware of the question of institutional abuse as a persistent and enduring problem, something which Defence have recognised for some time, but something also which the Australian Defence Force have not really attempted to manage effectively. So it comes back to this question of whether militaries are inherently dysfunctional. I guess my position is that militaries are institutions of and for violence, and that the command and hierarchy does not permit for the right sorts of checks and balances and accountability, which means that the imperative to be able to prosecute violence in a conflict zone tends to flourish within the ranks and within the units themselves. So there are two kind of key points, I guess, that I want to get across. So bastardisation can involve a class structure. So usually a course is maybe 4 years long. So if a course is 4 years long, then the most senior class has the capacity and the authority to mete out justice on the first class. And that usually involves rituals of things like nuggeting or woofering. You probably don't know what these terms are, but nuggeting is when the soldiers will strip down the other member and then completely cover their genitals in boot polish. Woofering is when a vacuum is applied to the cadets' genitals. Shaving people, sexually assaulting them, rape, the use of objects and things like that is quite common. And this history, funnily enough, is well recorded through the Royal Military College Duntroon, which, strangely enough, there's through the archival work I've done, we got there's a document called Fight the Good Fight, and it comes from Kingston RMC, so Canada. So that connection to Canada to Duntroon in Australia is quite strong around the 1930s, and some of these types of acts and practices we sort of picked up from here apparently. Anyway, so military institutional abuse or defence abuse, that's kind of the word that I want to use. And why is it institutional? It's institutional because the military, as I said, is an institution of and for violence. It's hierarchical, and its main game is to prosecute violence. And so this creates a potential in the institution for abuse and violence. Now the commander class has a particular culture of having to look after their career and watch for their next posting and not to become a victim themselves. So there's a lot of non-reporting or suppression or trying to quieten things down. And that means that no one is going to take up the challenge to try and fix this and to try and address it in more formal sort of ways. In 2011, we had an incident called the Skype incident. That's was at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and this brought the issue of institutional abuse to a head. There's been about 45 reviews over the last 50 years. I've got a few slides on those I'll show you, which means that it's a persistent and enduring issue, but it is always been suppressed and forgotten and displaced. So in 2011, a group of 5 cadets, one of those cadets had a relationship or a sort of sexual relationship with a female cadet, and unknown to her, he filmed her through his computer to his mates into the next room. So it was an illegal broadcast of their sexual activity. But they then distributed the material across the college. This became quite public, and it created a national sort of uproar. Another military sex scandal, not the first one. But what it did was to really bring civil society, the military and the state into some conflict. And the Defence Minister pursued the commanders. There was an inquiry process, investigations, and then a reparation process called the Defence Abuse Response Task Force. And so that's been running since about 2012, and there are about 6,000 cases, and reparations have been made. So I would say in the last 5 years, after a bit of a flurry of activity, it's died off, and Defence are really not looking very serious, like they want to address the matter again. In fact, the attention has sort of moved from institutional abuse to veteran suicide. Now, The other key point I wanted to raise is around martial culture. And so, as I mentioned to you before, being an infantry soldier in a unit full of men living, working, playing hard, the way to describe that is in terms of military masculinities. And while military masculinities can be diverse across the services and corps, they all have a particular relationship to martial culture. That is, to be warlike and to be prosecute that violence. So it's in these environments, training environments, and these sorts of arms corps environments where the violence and the abuse is at its worst. As I said before, the traditions of this violence are men on men, but when women enter the services in the mid-80s, then the issue of military sexual assault gains greater volume and greater exposure because women are being subject to men's culture. The Australian Defence Force moved into a volunteer force in the after Vietnam, and so it means it has to draw on a different talent pool to maintain its recruitment, and that means women and others come to the environment, and then we see the abuse become far more public because it is more exposed. So finishing up, these are the cultural reviews and commissions. There's 45 of them since 1913. And they cover a whole range of issues from learning cultures, training environments, military justice, cultures at training institutions, sexual harassment on Navy ships and in other units. So that's it. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. So, no slides for my presentation. I'm an anthropologist, and my research has focused on the prison system of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Brazil's prison systems are administered at the state level. So when I say Rio, I'm meaning the state, which is the city that everyone knows, and then kind of a little bit of the surrounding area. Anyway, that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I think looking at the title, that my task should be to think about whether Brazilian prisons, or maybe prisons in general, are inherently dysfunctional. And to me, this is a very interesting provocation, but it's also difficult to answer because it also rubs up against the question of what is the function of prison, specifically in Brazil, or maybe, just in general as well. So today, what I'm trying to answer this by going through 3 different kind of functions of prison that people identified as I was doing my fieldwork, and consider how we might use them to kind of get back to answer this question. So the first answer we might look at, the first function, we can call reform, or maybe rehabilitation. If you look at Brazilian legislation, the purpose of prisons is very clear. So the first line of the law of penal execution states that punishment should, quote, provide conditions for the harmonious social reintegration of the convicted, end quote. So in English, it would probably be called rehabilitation. In Portuguese, the term resocialization is far more common, or sometimes re-education. And the motto of Rio de Janeiro's prison system is re-socialize to conquer the future. Now, during my fieldwork, the public face of the prison administration was a man named Colonel Gilson, who was the Sub-Secretary of Treatment. So he was responsible for kind of all areas of healthcare, education, employment, and he coordinated the work of prison psychologists, social workers, and religious volunteers within the state's 54 prisons. He'd often show up to events in the place of the actual secretary of the administration, who was just kind of known for being chronically absent. And he came always with what I came to call his good news spiel. So he would always bring news of new planned reforms or projects. And this was always accompanied by a very specific argument that he would repeat almost word for word. So I've got a quote here that's one version of it, but it really didn't vary much. Quote, "Here in Brazil, we have no death penalty and we have no life sentence. Every person inside prison, every single one, will one day leave. It's our responsibility together to make sure that they leave in a better state than when they entered, and that they have an opportunity to prove their worth to our society," end quote. So I want to be clear today that this is a lie, at least in part. Each year, more than 300, it varies between 300 and about 600 people die in Rio's prisons. The system's own records show that those in prison are about 5 times more likely to die of supposedly natural causes than the general population. It is true that Brazil has no formal death penalty, but they do have what many describe as a de facto death penalty, in the sense that that year in which I was conducting my fieldwork, Rio's police killed 1,245 people. 86% of those were identified as black. And to give a comparison to another kind of famous police homicide state, the United States, that means that more people were killed by police in Rio de Janeiro specifically than all of the United States in that year. Colonel Gilson, though, was right in pointing to resocialization reform as, again, this kind of legal responsibility of the administration. And I think he kind of meant it as well as a kind of moral responsibility. Now, if this is how we evaluate it, then Rio's prisons are clearly dysfunctional. The plans that Gilson brought every meeting actually never materialized, and in a sense it was his job to sell the promise of resocialization because that's all he had to offer, because the administration's funding priorities skewed very heavily towards security and custody over treatment, so he could produce all these plans that would constantly kind of cycle through and they never actually materialize. Opportunities for work, I just lost my spot. Yeah, opportunities for work or education were scarce inside prison, and those who were released got no support from the government. I conducted my fieldwork between 2014 and 2018, and the support for people who left actually kind of gradually diminished over that time as well. I actually can't give a quantitative measure of this failure because recidivism rates, which are commonly used to kind of assess the success or failure of rehabilitation, just don't exist in Brazil. They're not recorded. In smaller studies and other estimates have ranged from 25% to 80%. That means people who have been arrested within 5 years of release. That's the kind of standard measure. But with a range of 25 to 80%, I don't like there's just no real understanding of how many people are recidivists in the first place. This kind of failure was, for prison workers, incarcerated people, and many activists, a motivation to push for rehabilitative programming, more social workers, more educational opportunities. This wasn't necessarily an inherent dysfunction of the institution, despite the fact that nobody within institutional memory had any kind of recollection of when prisons were actually reformative. There was this kind of constant push in that direction. But as one social worker argued once to me, resocialization was never the real purpose of imprisonment. And in her words, it was a kind of makeup, that was her term, that distracted from what prisons really are and what they do. So here we might move on to another kind of definition, another function, which is security. So if the law says one thing about what prisons are, politicians and media outlets in Brazil say something very different, which is that prisons and punishment are about the fight against crime, punishing, isolating, and incapacitating felons in order to promote security in Brazil. At a kind of abstract level, and especially at a kind of academic level, this idea is very questionable, since criminologists in Brazil, in the United States, and elsewhere have pointed out that there's little correlation between the number of people in prison and rates of reported crime. And in Brazil specifically, it's also known that the collectives that dominate drug trafficking, which are called factions, all emerged from and still operate out of the nation's prisons, which means that they have become hubs for crime rather than barriers to it. But it's also true that criticisms of Brazil's prisons and their apparent insecurities have historically served not to improve conditions or even to radically change their structure, but rather to build more prisons, to increase funding, and to militarize the institution. Prisons and the criminal justice system more broadly in Brazil reflect a broad sense of insecurity and violence that many citizens feel and experience, and a desire to isolate and remove those who are seen as inherently criminal. And punitive politics, by which I mean a kind of push for more policing, more punishment, harsher prison sentences, kind of harsher prisons generally, has been a real dominant force in the country since at least the 1980s, so since the end of the military dictatorship and the most recent transition to democracy. Now, before this time, it was the dictatorship, it was the military itself that announced itself as the guarantor of order and security in the nation, and if anybody's kind of followed the political turmoil in the last few years, you still see protesters calling for military intervention to restore order in the country. Now, security has been used to justify the continued presence of the military in politics and public life. So while denunciations of insecurity denunciations of security kind of serve to increase their presence in various sectors, including in the prison administration. I called him Colonel Gilson, but he was actually one of the few people in the higher ranks of Rio's prison administration who was not actually a colonel. And I think that it's very kind of telling that his boss and everybody around him was a colonel, so he just kind of like got that title by default as a kind of marker of respect, and not to kind of single him out. This was because all of these kind of higher up figures were appointed by the state's governor directly from the military. This was in 2017, so at the following year, the final year of my fieldwork, Rio de Janeiro declared a state of calamity for all of its security institutions, which led to, among other things, the federal military taking over the administration of the entire prison system. So where before there were these individual military figures in the administration, the following year it formally became under the auspices of the military for about 2 years until the state of calamity was declared over. At the same time, if you kind of go down the hierarchy of the administration, in 2017, correctional officers embarked on a year-long campaign, including several strikes, to deliberately expose and get media coverage of the violence of the prison system and of their kind of precarious position within it. But this denunciation of how kind of dysfunctional prisons were also served essentially for their ultimately successful push to be reclassified as a police force, a shift that increased their pay, made them less accountable for violences committed against incarcerated people, and made it much easier for them to carry firearms both inside and out of prison. I say this to make 2 points. First is a very kind of Foucauldian point that like prisons are fueled by prison reform movement, right? That these kind of critiques that we make of prisons as dysfunctional don't necessarily serve to change prisons as much as to perpetuate them. And in the case of my fieldwork, this also was part of it makes me very nervous to put in my position to say that prisons are dysfunctional, knowing that that critique has also been used to serve for the militarization of prisons in the first place. And I just wondered, how these critiques ultimately become expedient and people make careers out of them, and ultimately, this is really shaped what prisons are today, not necessarily in the way that its original critics intended. So if those are the first two, I'll end with my final kind of function, and with an ethnographic story. So Hillary was an incarcerated black travesti, a trans woman who I worked with during my research. She was nearing the end of her sentence and received the right to day release, so we spent our time together at a bar just across the road from the prison where she slept at night, or in a favela, the kind of peripheral community just a few minutes walk down the road. It was there that she once asked me if I knew that prisons were first built to hold slaves. I told her what I knew then from my research, that at least one prison still running in Rio was in the same site as a jail that used to hold those who were captured as they attempted to flee slavery, and that Brazil's first police force was actually organized to respond to the perceived threat of a growing emancipated black population. She nodded as she responded, quote, "It's like my friend said, prisons are meant to hold black people," end quote. So Hillary has a point. Although black people make up about 51% of the population of Rio de Janeiro as a whole, the state, there are about 75% of those imprisoned. Brazil's first penitentiary was built by both enslaved and recently emancipated black laborers, and the first criminal code in the new Brazilian Republic explicitly criminalized Afro-Brazilian religious traditions. This is why, incidentally, the prison museum in Rio has the best and largest archive of religious artifacts because they were confiscated in the early 20th century. Between 2012 and 2016, Rio saw an explosion in the prison population precisely because the police were now permanently occupying peripheral black neighborhoods, partly in the name of transforming the city for the 2014 FIFA World Cup and 2016 Olympic Games. The recent, supposedly progressive decriminalization of drug possession in Brazil in 2009 nevertheless gave the police discretion to charge black residents as traffickers rather than users, and resulted in massive increases to their sentences, while generally white drug users were kind of let off the hook. And as a result of this decriminalization, the prison population and the percentage of those incarcerated for drug-related offenses increased rather than decreased. At the same time, black Brazilians are more likely to be denied bail than their white counterparts and have less chance of securing parole. I think it's important here to highlight that many of these processes come from policing and courts rather than from the prisons themselves, which kind of occupy the end point of what we could think of as like a conveyor belt of criminal justice. Correctional officers and administrators like Colonel Gilson essentially have no control over who enters prison, who leaves, and when. But they do operate in an institution that overwhelmingly and disproportionately incapacitates black Brazilians, and which draws entire black families and communities into their orbit. Compared to both resocialization and security, Hillary's observations that prisons function to hold black people comes far closer to describing what these institutions actually seem to do in the present. In doing so, she also kind of echoes the work of other scholars, and I'm thinking here about possibly, if you're familiar with black feminists in the United States like Mariam Kaba, who pointed out that diagnosing the dysfunction of prisons misses the point, first because it calls for technical and policy solutions to structural problems, and it also seems to always result in a kind of prescription for more, right? For more security, more punishment, or more reform, all of which seem to translate into more prisons, more staff, more military influence, more funding, and more kind of fuel for what is essentially an anti-black enterprise. So to come with this critique of Brazilian prisons as dysfunctional might be missing the point that they're doing exactly what was intended. Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I was just saying earlier that I wished I was just chair and not presenting because I'm so enjoying listening, and I kind of wish I could just keep and write notes, but I do have a short portion to add. So as I said in the beginning, over the last decade I've done work on war crimes, sexual abuse in the military, military suicide, the challenge of gender integration. So most of my work takes a fairly pessimistic look, or it takes a fairly pessimistic approach to this question of military reform. And so the work today is a little less pessimistic, though not much. But the question of whether militaries can reform is actually a very important question for feminist scholars in particular. There are different takes from feminist scholars. There's anti-militarist feminists who would argue sort of what Ben was signaling, that militaries are inherently racist, colonial, violent institutions that are not capable of reform, that are always and are inherently dysfunctional. There are sort of reformist feminists that take a sort of regendering approach, that incremental change is possible and should be part of the goal. And then there's sort of critical mass, although critical mass theory has long been abandoned by feminists. Policymakers really love it, and most militaries take a critical mass approach, which is this idea that achieving a certain percentage of women or minoritized communities will reform institutions. So that's usually around 30%. Militaries, no Western military has achieved anywhere close to 30%, so it does sort of create a like wait and see, indefinitely kind of approach. But what I want to just give a little snapshot of what it looks like to actually study this question of reform within a very particular institution. So to give you a nuts and bolts kind of look at what reform kind of looks like in a case. So this is the NZDF, the New Zealand Defence Forces. We set out, we meaning myself and some of my co-researchers in New Zealand, or Beth Greener, Nina Harding, and Amy Brosnan, were actually asked by the New Zealand Army to come in and do an analysis of how gender is operating in the Army. We're not funded by the Army, so we do have an arm's length, but they did give us access to analyzing the Army, really trying to understand how gender operates, what kind of pressures exist, and whether, how they're doing in terms of gender reform, right? Which is a major goal of many Western militaries, including our own Canadian Defence Forces. Many Western militaries right now are in what we would call a cultural crisis, in part as a result of gender issues. The Canadian Defence Forces, for example, has had 2 years of ongoing scandals related to sexual misconduct. We also have evidence of white supremacy within the military, and this is very common across other defense forces. So here I think we have an example of an institution that's actually genuinely interested in reform, putting resources behind reform when it comes to gender, and what it looks like in terms of analyzing whether that's working. So we had the full consent of the Army, New Zealand Army. It did happen over COVID, and so luckily most of New Zealand was not under a lockdown for most of the pandemic, so my New Zealand colleagues were able to take part in observing promotion boards, observing officer selection boards, cadet school, gender training, to kind of understand how the Army is operationalizing, it's working to address gender. And I sort of took the lead on the survey since I could do it from here. And we conducted a survey and we had 1,600 participants, which when you realize that the New Zealand Army is only 4,500 people, you realize that's a very good sample size. And so we do have a strong sense of many different questions in terms of how gender is operating. So I'm not going to be able to talk about much, but I want to talk in particular about backlash and how backlash operates when we're trying to reform. So despite some gains made in areas related to gender within defense forces, including, I guess, okay, I'm going to try not to be cynical, but I'm a little tired and I'm just going to let it come through. There's been a reduction in overt sexism, so here are some of the gains made. We don't see the overt language that used to be acceptable within defense forces. There have been certain roles that have been opened to women, although we know from my research that that doesn't actually lead to much reform. We also have new policies in many Western militaries opening and accepting transgender, gender non-conforming members. So even though we have some gains, from the survey we see one of the main questions, or a big question that kind of came out, this question of, are there obstacles to women being leaders in the Army? So we asked a bunch of questions, and I'm not going to be able to talk too much, but what was interesting is that 80% of women said there's still obstacles. And even the majority of men said there's still obstacles. And what's interesting about the responses when we kind of get them to add some qualitative to that is that those that said there's no obstacles, and this actually seems very familiar to other contexts, respondents said, well, men and women have the same opportunities, it's a merit-based system, whether anyone can do the job. And then there's this issue of overcompensating, which I'll come back to. And then those that said there are obstacles really focus on quite concrete things. Pregnancy, parental leave impacts women differently. The emphasis on physical fitness, the standards set for men's bodies were an issue. And again, this issue of overcompensating. So what was interesting is we had this theme of overcompensating in the yes and the no categories. And what overcompensating looked like is that all this attention to gender has either solved the problem or actually created more problems for women. So those that thought that everything's fine, there's no obstacles for women said, look, we're doing so much for women, everything's equal. And some of this, in the same, yes, there are problems for women, said, look, all of this attention to women has actually created problems for me. Now people think I got this job because I'm a woman. So this theme of overcompensating was quite huge. So some of the elements, this idea that women are spotlighted, seen as being given opportunities only because they're women, a sense of overcorrecting or over-accommodating women, the pendulum swinging too far, belief that extra attention to women is detrimental to them being seen as competent, and men seeing themselves as being disadvantaged. So that really, not just for this question, but just the survey answers in general, really caused us to, I'll come back, to kind of rethink how gender learning seems to be happening in the Army. And what I will say from having sat in on, even in the Canadian Defence Forces, a lot of the plans for cultural reform, for addressing dysfunction, look like the first three here. If we think of awareness raising as the first one, assume kind of a linear process of cultural change, of reform, of any kind of change, that you raise awareness, you roll out education plans, you roll out new policies, and then you have acceptance and better behavior, end of story. But what we see from the survey data that we have is that the social model of learning is really out of line with what most reform projects and policies actually look like in this linear model. And most don't take account of these two other elements that we found throughout the surveys and actually throughout our observations and interviews, which are information fatigue and resistance and backlash. So backlash is actually an interesting sort of term. We've heard a lot about gender backlash, I think particularly since the election of Trump. It's often very kind of loosely or poorly defined as like resistance to the status quo, resistance to gender reforms. So part of what I hope this work will do is just sort of provide a bit more nuance to the idea of gender backlash. So I just want to say a couple of things about what fatigue and backlash look like. The key difference between fatigue, it's really we have all this awareness raising, I get it, I'm on board, but I'm very tired. In contrast, backlash is very much a rejection of the message. So fatigue might take the form of a response conveying that the message is fine, but I'm tired of hearing about it. But backlash is saying, I actually disagree. So I'll come back to that. So an example of fatigue, I'll just let you read this, because I don't really want to read it out loud. Well, I can, but you can read it, I think. So I cannot tell you how many quotes we have that look like very similar to this. That everywhere you turn, we have gender sessions, we have too much attention to this, and I get it, this kind of exact message. And really, this is a very clear example of being tired of it. This is an example of what I would say is backlash. So backlash is like, I do not want this anymore. One thing I wanted to go back to this is that really, again, these models of attempts for reform are not taking into account that the majority of service members that we interviewed are actually experiencing one of these two, that they're experiencing some level of fatigue, including women. And a significant number of the male respondents expressed some form of backlash. And one particular kind of, this is the last point, part of backlash was this emphasis on spotlighting, this perception that women get positions, trips, places on courses, awards because they're women rather than because they're the most competent candidate. So almost half of men and women brought this up. Women often brought it up as a concern that their success was going to be perceived as a success only because they were women. They also questioned their own success and their own capabilities because of it. And men really, really brought up, again, like this quote, this sense that they couldn't succeed in the army because they were not a woman. So I think this is important because it really goes to the point that reform is not linear, and institutions act like it is linear. You have to roll out, again, a sort of plan, and that you would have behavior change. And really understanding what backlash looks like and how it evolves over time is important in any institution, including university institutions, I would argue. All right, so thank you. Okay, now I'm going to change into being a chair. So we have some time for questions. I don't know, Kaylin, if you don't mind being our mic person, if you...
Sure. Just like pass it.
Yeah,
sure.
If you have a question, if you could wait for a mic just so that it can be picked up on the video.
I don't need my, based on the title, the inherent dysfunction of military, if your nation, if your government is dysfunctional, then your military is going to be dysfunctional. It's what is the primary concern is what is the government like? Like, look at Syria, Russia. You compare Russia to Ukraine. The Ukraine military, well, is to a degree dysfunctional, but based on its leadership, It's incredibly functional. It's protecting the people. So it's the being dysfunctional is what's causing your dysfunction. Venezuela, et cetera, you know, narco states, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Colombia is just like, I mean, it's unbelievable history. You know, the you know, like you said, the FARC and all of it. It's just mind-boggling. The cartels in Mexico, and you know, El Chapo's in prison in the United States, and it's just like, you know, what it's just so overwhelming. It's so, I mean, yeah, the sense of dysfunctional it's you know, it's like this miasma of, you know, tentacled reach. I found with Australia, when your option, the open door, to actually do something, to have the experience, and then say, okay, here's what I'm doing that is a viable response to the dysfunction, you know, to actually to react to and get something practical going. With regards to women, my experience in the military is what really stood out is that with women in the military, when they have authority, and the commissioned officer ranks in the infantry, if the woman's character was like, she was like a good person, like it just, the leadership, like the lower ranks just gravitated. They knew she was like a good person. If a woman had a sort of like an anger, which she expressed through her authority with the hostility, it was like, that was dangerous. But I have seen infantry soldiers literally gravitate to a female infantry officer, rank level captain, and she commanded like a light armored vehicle with a 23mm cannon, and the entire crew just like, she was a good person. And there was an inherent natural group reaction, you know, that this is good command. So if it's either, you know, if there's dysfunction there, you will get dysfunctional reactions. If it's functional, you get functional reactions. So I think, like, of everything that was said, your open door strategy, what you're doing is really bringing something up, like, that's good, that's gonna, like, sort of, you know, it's a solution. But there's just too much to be. Everyone that you presented was like, oh, I was just like, no, I've got to say this or do this. It's a very good presentation.
I can answer the first question.
Do you have a...
Oh, I could actually take one of these.
Yep.
Or if you could just pass. Right. Sorry, we didn't get your name.
Paul.
Thank you, Paul, for the contribution. Actually, academics have thought about this, what you say as armies being a mirror image of governments. There's a book by Jason Lyle at Dartmouth, which is called Divided Armies, Inequality and Battlefield Performance in Modern War, that came out just last year. And it is true what you say, that whatever is going on in the political institutions of the country, those are reflected in the army. Nevertheless, even the most dysfunctional democracies have some interest in reforming their militaries in different forms and ways. They actually they get a lot of funding from USAID and other organizations to reform their militaries. And sometimes maybe it is very difficult to change the governments, to go and restructure the Colombian government and make sure no police officer is corrupt, etc. But then there are ways that militaries can be reformed without requiring an overhaul of the government. And there's interest in that. There are different ways of doing it, and I guess this panel is trying to sort of get at different ways that maybe there could be reform if that is possible.
Can I say something? Oh, it's very interesting, but isn't that just the nature of an army? I mean, aren't they always, historically, they must have always been dysfunctional. It's never going to change, because at the bottom you have to have like bloodlust, you have to be a killer. What the Russians are doing, emptying their prisons, you know, like maybe at the top, you know, the English, they'd have their Sandhurst, the Americans have their West Point, where the military at the top shows some guidance, the English would go down with the ship to, rather, it would be embarrassing to come back to be defeated. But it's just, it's an animal. Like what Bush said about Noriega, you know, he might be a pit bull, but he's our pit bull. It's just the nature of war. You can't sanitize it. At the top you might control it, but at the end, the people that are doing the killing, I mean, some of them, like you said, the far right, there's a lot of psychos in a lot of militaries. I don't think you can ever get that out. I mean, some of the military probably, they deliberately created, they need this esprit de corps, and however vicious it is, it serves their purpose when you're going over the top. Or, I don't know, I mean, it's a nice idea, but it's, and from the top you can have something, but at the bottom it relies on the most basic, the ugliest of human nature, and that's, I don't think you're ever going to change it. Oh.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the kind of violence that you're saying is necessary or is an imperative for the military, yes, you do need to be able to have that person that can kick down the door. But if it isn't managed in an effective manner, then it actually has suboptimal outcomes for your tactical effectiveness, your tactical dominance. We've got a Royal Commission into veteran suicide in Australia at the moment, and where the narrative is that it's largely about deployment. But we're learning, I'm quite heavily involved in it, that these sorts of cultures of violence on your own is having these sorts of outcomes. People take their lives because they're being harassed and abused and bullied. And so the question is, do you have to be a thug to be a good soldier? Can you have a military which has an ethic of care? And that may sound contradictory or silly, but in fact, it's a kind of a discourse which even our own commanders in Australia have tried to roll. They've tried to run with this idea that we don't have to be complete thugs to be complete bastards to be good soldiers. So I believe that if you had better leadership, better accountability, then you could attenuate that potentiality for violence.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I also
Yeah.
respond to that question? Sure. I guess my point is, if everybody is a psycho, as you say.
Not everyone.
If they're always psychos in state militaries, then we should be seeing certain forms of dysfunctionality, that some of which has been raised by the panelists here in all the militaries. Let's take sexual violence. We should, see just sexual violence across the board in state militaries, but that's actually not the case. The paper that Colleen mentioned that I have forthcoming, it's actually in press right now, discusses why some state militaries engage in sexual violence and others don't. Why is it that the US military, when it goes to Iraq, it engages in sexual violence, but when they're in Germany, they don't, right? So if these are the same psychos, like why are they performing differently? And excuse my use of the word psycho, I'm just using it lightly, but if these are the same people motivated by the same issues, then why are they behaving differently in one context and not another? And to sort of give away what we find in that paper, it's that physical integrity laws and norms in a society matter. When state militaries come from a society, not with gender norms, but with very definite physical integrity laws and norms, and there's this issue of accountability that Ben mentioned, they do not engage with in sexual violence, which is one of the dysfunctionalities of militaries. You might be interested that this behavior is also paralleled in state militaries that are stationed abroad. So these are usually explained with principal-agent problems. When the agents are away from the principal, when the cat is away, the mice tend to play. But then even state militaries that come from countries with very strong laws and norms against physical integrity
assaults, then they do not engage in one of these dysfunctionalities of militaries. So it's so if state militaries were always dysfunctional, then we should be seeing certain dysfunctionalities across the board, but we don't. Thank you. Thank you for your question. That was really good.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think it mirrors in some ways much of the sort of public imaginary about the military, and certainly popular representation that in order to be a soldier you have to be, and part of the exceptionalizing of the soldiers, that you can't be a soldier unless you really have what it takes. So I definitely have heard that. I do think it's important to remember that militaries across most Western countries are the most trusted public institution and define themselves according to discipline, codes of conduct. And so in many ways, we should expect the opposite, that we shouldn't have any psychos in the military, that they need to be the most disciplined and follow the rules of war. And by the time that they are faced with whether to kill someone or not, they should be so clear on the instructions, not their gut feeling, right? That it should be a denial of any kind of animal instinct, using that language. And in fact, what's happening, what we see with some of the war crimes investigations, is it's precisely this perception that some service members, some men in particular, when they join the military, they expect it to be bloodlust. They expect it to be more exciting. And especially infantry soldiers, they think they're gonna go and have a very exciting time, and most of what they do is very boring. And this is what happened with most of the war crimes committed by Australian service members and US service members. Most of the justifications that the service members themselves gave is they were so bored, and that they started to do drops of weapons to kill civilians because they needed something to do. They wanted to use their weapons training. They wanted to have this excitement that they actually were sort of sold on in recruitment. And so I think many militaries, the Australian Defence Force, say they're trying to, I don't know how they're doing that, but they really want to get away from this sort of warrior mentality because it's so counterproductive. And for the most part, this is why we hear like the professionalization of the military, right? That it's a profession, that it's so I think it's important, and I also think that that kind of logic is what leads to justification of sexual assault too, like that the military attracts such a like uncontrollable soldier that what do you expect when they're alone and under duress with women around, like they're gonna assault, like that is very much part of the narrative. So that keeping that in the discourse actually fuels sort of justification of war crimes and assault. So yeah, so I think it's a really important question, and it's certainly something that's still part of the discussion of military. I don't know if you want to add it.
No, we can open it up again.
Okay. The best way to go around. There you go.
Thanks. Hello. Okay. Thank you very much. That was a great panel. So it's very effective on your phone. This is probably a question for Ben, but of course anybody can field it. You were sort of painting a picture of the military being a very unique institution, and I found your argument to be pretty convincing. But I'm also wondering if we can, learn some things by looking, comparing with other institutions, and thinking about similar features with other institutions. And the one I wanted to roll out was to think about, for example, abuse in the Catholic Church, which I'm sure you guys have, sort of heard this comparison many times before, but sort of the fact that abuse was able to flourish as a result of some of the same considerations that you mentioned, people at the top wanting to hush it up, lack of transparency, lack of access to regular sort of legal channels and so on. So I just wanted to sort of raise, that sort of comparison. And I thought the prison comparison was actually pretty, was interesting because it did get us a little bit outside of sort of just thinking about militaries. But I just wanted to hear if anybody had any thoughts on whether there are lessons to be learned from similar institutions where there are similar kinds of dynamics that emerge. Thank you.
There's some important work in sociology, anthropology around total institutions, which is that sort of idea that one's daily life is all consumed by that particular institution, and that it's very hierarchical, formalised, and because it's a total institution, it has a separation from civil society or outside cultural influences. This is very much what we see with the defence institution, is that it's very defensive, and it's almost like it's circling the wagons all the time. So in Australia, and I'm pretty sure in other Five Eyes nations, we can see similar issues of sexual assault and abuse and lack of command accountability in police institutions, also in Australian prisons, and in other paramilitary type organisations. I think it's not something I know a lot about, but we know that there is cultures of sexual assault in market corporations as well, but is it the same? I think there are quite distinct differences, and I think that if you're going to develop policy and programs, then you have to understand the nature of the institution or the organisation to be able to work with it effectively. Is everyone in the military tarnished by these sorts of dysfunctional kinds of practices? No, I think militaries can still be quite productive sort of spaces, and camaraderie, tradition, long-term friendships, looking after people, that sort of stuff there as well. So I think there's a potential, right? There's violence, as I see, there's a potential that under certain circumstances becomes is allowed to flourish, and so I think the very difficult thing in terms of reform is that command is so invested in their careers and in their status that no one's willing to stick their head out and say this is. Well, we had David Morrison, didn't we? But so I don't know, you may not know the story of David Morrison. He was a Lieutenant General, Chief of Army. We had this guy. We had a thing called the Jedi Council, which was where about 30 personnel were taking videos of women and had a ledger and were engaging in sort of rape and other things like that. And he came out and he was very strong, and he made a viral message on YouTube, and the Americans have talked to me about how brilliant that was, and the British thought it was great too. But what happened in terms of meeting talks about backlash? He became the most hated man in the Australian Defence Force. So a real, really heavy consequence for taking a bit of a stand. So paramilitary organisations have similar characteristics which create a potential for this, and the church is a closed institution too.
Sure. So, I mean, the RCMP is a paramilitary institution, right? And it's, but I think what sort of interests me about it is that it has these like two different faces. One is the sort of domestic face, and then there's the international. And, there's like wiki pages devoted to outlining how the RCMP is involved in all kinds of scandals, including sexual assault cases, harassment. There's a couple of large class action lawsuits, reports, and so forth about the dysfunction of the institution. But it's all focused on the domestic front, right? And of course, it's also related back to things like residential schools and how the RCMP were kind of critical to the development of settler colonialism in Canada. But the international face is what kind of, arguably tries to recover that reputation, in part because the international work of peacekeeping involving police officers, not military, is often seen as a lighter touch. There's a lot of kind of professional, there's kind of like a professionalism sort of attached to international policing. And I think what's interesting about that is that you don't see the same kinds of scandals or concerns. And in fact, what I'm looking at right now is how the Canadian government is sort of invested in the idea that international policing activities actually create new possibilities for better policing at home that's more culturally sensitive to diverse communities, including Indigenous populations, the large Haitian population in Montreal, for example. But I think like it's a claim that needs to be tested. And I guess the other thing I would say is that while I agree like that there are countries that are have different kinds of problems related to sexual exploitation and abuse with respect to their militaries and police forces, what I'm kind of interested in is how it still seems to exist in a way that, or on a level that seems extraordinary to me. And so, I still think that still has to be explained. Even if we can acknowledge that there are ways to do reform, there are ways to improve, there still is, I think, arguably a persistence there that I'm still curious about. So.
Do you want to gather more questions? Sure.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess the question I have is one that's been kind of kicking around in a bunch of different questions, and Tamara asked, I think, the first person raised this issue, which is at least implicitly about what's the comparison here for militaries? Like, what are the major social institutions that don't have the problems that you're identifying in militaries, and which one of these institutions has managed to solve the problem? So if the question is, are militaries unreformable, counterfactually or realistically, which institutions, universities, churches, religious organizations, who's been successful where the military hasn't?
Maybe I can start. I mean, I do think it's a great question. I do think there is something different about these kind of total institutions, using the language that Ben mentioned. I think there's something different about the church, and I think it's a great example. And I think in Canada, of Hockey Canada, for example, where you have, something that's very different from what's happening in terms of universities. Like, can you imagine in universities open hazing happening still? But the level, I guess the level that we're talking about in militaries is so overt. And so in the Canadian Defence Forces, you have 12 senior leaders being accused of sexual misconduct in the last 2 years. So, I mean, it's not that there's, of course, it's not that there's hazing, not that there's not hazing on campus, or there's not comparisons, but the level of silencing, the culture of silence, the way that the type of masculinity that's valorized within military institutions, I think, is pretty unique compared to universities, for example, and it's different from hockey organizations, but hockey organizations have their own version of masculinities that's valorized. So it's not to say that there's no comparisons, but I do think the public acceptance of sexual violence within these institutions it's no secret. We've known that sexual assault, for example, has been happening in the last, basically since we've started measuring it as a form of misconduct. But the public acceptance of very high levels of sexual assault within the military is very different, I think, from any other workplace. It's different from the levels of sexual assault that we would permit on campus, for example. And the way that, of those 12 senior leaders, none of them are likely to face any consequences. So the way that senior military members become absolved of these crimes is pretty interesting. I mean, not that you have like Brock Turner and you have very high profile examples of individuals not being held responsible. I mean, I think within a patriarchal structure, of course, there's mirrors of the way the institutions work, but I think that for me, militaries are where these kind of coalesce. in ways that are particular and not exclusive.
Isn't just to kind of follow up here, I mean, maybe though the indicators you're using are pointing to the wrong things or different things than you're thinking about. I mean, in the church, right, when a priest did something horrendous, that what would happen? That person would get shuffled off to some other parish. Nothing, no one would talk about it. It would happen again. They get shuffled off again. It was years and years and years before anything came out. 12 military officers in the Canadian military have been accused publicly of engaging in sexual misconduct. One of them lost a position that he was going to get as a result. There was a consequence. I mean, the fact that these allegations are being made publicly by people might actually be evidence not of a lack of reform, but a fact that a changing standard that that the military is now subject to. And in fact, it's a sign of enormous progress rather than the opposite.
Yeah, and that's certainly how the Canadian Defence Forces was saying that attention to these issues often dies down and rates often just stay at the same level. That's what the data shows. So it could totally change, and I try and some days be hopeful, but I'm not super optimistic it's a watershed moment.
Thank you for bringing this subject. My question is about for example, Israel army is known for being very so-called civilized, but is there any data on how much sexual abuse happens within the Israeli army? And because the discipline of the soldier doesn't show their non-violent approach, it's much more violent. And how much the international training, like a lot of militaries do group training or many countries, are there any rules for that type when the armies mix and whether there is sexual abuse between them? And just the last point is about army in the United Nations, because in Congo and many parts of the world, the United Nations army has the reputation of having a lot of abuse, and I don't know whether there is any rules regarding this. And we also find Scotland Yard also having problems yesterday. Thank you.
I don't know a bit about any data on Israel, sorry. But I know that Israel is a very different kind of military to the Australian Defence Force, for example. Everyone in Israel has some connection to the military. And I think when we talk about that in civil military relations, or at least a critical understanding of civil military relations, that we know that the more of a reduction of a culture gap between civil society and militaries appears to create some form of integration or accountability. So the Australian Defence Force, since Vietnam, that gap has increased significantly. And so it becomes a greater gap between the kinds of broader community standards of what the military culture is like. So I think if I was going to try and understand sexual assault in Israel, one of the first things I'll be doing is trying to understand the nature of the force, the culture of having an integrated military that is, well integrated with the broader society. All I'd have on that.
I could take a stab because I have the data right in front of me. So we have data on sexual violence committed by state militaries stationed at home between 1989 and 2015. And the reason I have this on my phone is because this is the paper that I mentioned I worked on. For Israel, we have 34 years in our data, so 34 years because Israel is not a very old country. For 29 years of those stationed at home, the officers did not commit any sexual violence. For 4 years, there was level 1 of sexual violence, which means scattered amounts, and then for 1 year of that, there was a certain amount of sexual violence. So our data is on an ordinal scale, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 3 means widespread, and 2 means a certain amount. And for 1 year of the 34 years of the Israeli history, this has been the case. For 4 years, there has been a certain amount of sexual violence committed by the state military. So it's not, as you say, quote unquote, a civilized force.
And what about the United Nations? Do you have any comments on it?
I would just say, I'm not sure if I have the dates right, but the UN began a process of developing rules against sexual abuse and misconduct among anybody who is kind of part of among contributing countries under its jurisdiction. In 2005 was kind of a watershed moment where it developed into like a sort of more robust policy. I feel like, I could be wrong on the date, but I feel like it was 2013 when it actually became a zero tolerance, complete mandate of like no sexual misconduct or abuse. And by misconduct and sort of exploitation, it also meant things like transactional sex, right? So it wasn't just about, you know, instances of rape and assault, but also having sexual relations with people in some kind of exchange, or even in like love or like relationships because of the power differential. And so there were kind of stages to the development of the UN policy around the zero tolerance policy. I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, no, I've heard about that, but I was wondering how much is it in practice? Because
Well, that's the issue, yeah. So the problem that the UN has is that it has a rule, but it relies ultimately on contributing countries to provide troops, and many of those countries themselves don't have a zero tolerance policy, and the UN has a lot of difficulty enforcing a policy because contributing countries still are able to pull their people out when they want to. They're ultimately responsible for any kind of trial or investigation process beyond the UN's own initial investigation, and so the short answer is that the UN's capacity is very limited because it's at the behest of contributing countries to be able to even put forces together to begin with, and those contributing countries have their own policies and standards about what they're willing to tolerate or not.
yeah, thank you.
There was a problem brought up which is sort of parallel to what we've been discussing. It was sort of a casual remark that the anthropologist made that at least in the prisons in Brazil, and I'm pretty sure this is true elsewhere, that in practice they've become a center of criminality, not a place where it's extinguished. Now, I doubt seriously that any of the authorities get up in the morning thinking, how can I improve how criminal I am today, or how much criminality is happening in the country. So, however this happens, looks to me like it must come through a place of blindness, and I'm wondering if it's being studied much.
Yeah, I can answer that a little bit. This is not my area of research, but I can say that there's a lot of research being done on this in Brazil and across Latin America specifically. I think also, I mean, just the question of prisons as kind of criminogenic is kind of interest of people working in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. But I think Latin America, from 1990 to the present, most countries in Latin America have transformed from some of the lowest incarceration rates in the world to some of its highest. So Brazil now has the third highest prison population, I think, in the world in just kind of absolute number terms. And in that shift, a lot of scholars have started taking interest, and specifically in these kind of organized collective, what's called factions in Brazil. It's often kind of classed as gangs in English, but I use the term factions because I think it's actually kind of a little bit more expansive than what we normally think about when we think about gangs. These are also like provide infrastructure or like upgrades to neighborhoods and like run daycares and also trafficking, right? I'm an anthropologist, that's my excuse for not having the numbers for you, but like, I think, the question of like prisons as spaces that kind of promote crime, or at least kind of engender that. I mean, I think that's true to a certain extent. I think that's specifically true in Brazil. I think there's a lot of, I think that some of this research is also kind of exaggerating the problem in the sense that they suggest that like anyone who comes into prison in Brazil will come out like a hardened gang member, essentially, and I don't think that's necessarily true, but it does kind of place into question the government policy, which in the face of like what is essentially public knowledge in Brazil, that these collectives essentially coordinated from prisons, still insists on locking people up on harsher punishments as the solution to a crisis of insecurity that is commonly perceived to be the direct cause of these same groups. Yeah, and I think there's a certain kind of like, this kind of knee-jerk punitive reaction that doesn't necessarily correspond to like any real analysis of what's going on in the country. I mean, people that like, I don't know, there's a lot of smart people in Brazil who are like thinking through this as well, but it does seem that like, faced with this, the only kind of political response of the last 30 years is to be in more prison. Yeah.
Well, we can see that that's what's happened. It's just that somehow the way that it's I mean, you're giving a perfect example. The prisons have become the place where those organizing criminality have their enforcement mechanisms provided by the state. And the more they lock them up, the more their enforcement mechanisms for the criminal gangs get stronger. So there's got to be something about that dynamic that we could learn from so as to direct it.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of symbiotic relationship and this kind of like shared power that a lot of people have worked on. I mean, for anybody interested, I would recommend Sasha Dark and Graham Daniel Willis, who have both done a lot of this research in Brazil.
Well, I think we might end it here. I think we'll leave some room for discussion outside, and I just wanted to say thank you so much to all the panelists. I'm so pleased. It's such a rich discussion, and I think you can see the value, I think, of bringing people from different disciplines and also expanding the conversation, not just to militaries, but thinking about police, thinking about prisons, and also having the audience discussion and thinking about the positives and thinking about signs of reform is really helpful in my thinking, and I'm just so delighted with the conversation. So thank you so much, and thanks for your participation, everyone.